Hello, everybody. This is Rick, and welcome to Astral Club. This is Peter's soul rescue mission. Before we get into it, just want to mention Patreon. If you'd like to support this channel, like Rabbit Void, who has joined as a Patreon at Astral Master level, you can do so. And when you do, you get advanced episodes on Sunday, a library of downloaded episodes for your podcast app, and a Patreon email where we can talk back and forth. Next up, private lessons. If you'd like a lesson to learn to astral project, be more than glad to work with you. If you're interested, you'll find not only the link to Patreon, but also an email in the description where you can request info on a private lesson. If you recall, I was given an acolyte, an assistant, to work with me by my angel guide, and we were sent rather, to Ukraine, where we ministered to a number of souls who had perished and were suffering in the lower astral because of that particular war. And I thought Peter, who is the name of my acolyte, I don't think I mentioned it in that episode, but I have started working with him, and this is really the second episode where he's involved that I want to share. I thought he did such a good job in the Ukraine soul rescue that I would take him to Kensington, the area of Kensington in Philadelphia, which is currently inhabited by many tortured souls, both in the physical and in the lower astral. They're suffering from drug addiction, and the drug of choice nowadays in Kensington is a very evil, destructive concoction that the street labels as trank. It is a mixture of fentanyl with a horse large animal tranquilizer called xylazine mixed in to make it more powerful, as if fentanyl needs that extra help. And this particular concoction is causing massive amounts of deaths, suffering, and open sores that are quite disturbing to look at, much less I can imagine to experience. So it's quite the plague, and it seems like a never-ending job, but whenever possible and whenever I've got my consciousness and my psyche together, I try to go up there and do what little I can. Sometimes it seems like I'm trying to dam a mighty river with nothing but some popsicle sticks, but I do what I can. And I thought this might be a good opportunity to allow Peter more experience. He died about a little over 100 years ago, he told me, and he died in Ireland. He was an Irish priest. And that brings with it some strengths, but I think it also brings with it some weaknesses, which I have been working with him on to help him overcome some of the culture shock that is involved in working with people who are very different than some of the people that he worked with when he was a parish priest in Ireland. So I'm going to share this experience with you, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. So I left my body and I sent out a telepathic signal summoning Peter to come to me. And very quickly he appeared and kind of gave me a little bow and said, thank you for calling me Master Rick. And then I, of course, pulled him up short on that. I guess we haven't had that discussion yet. I said, it's just Rick. Please, I don't want to get into it. Drop the master thing right away. So he just nodded his head and said, okay, Rick. I then told him to concentrate with me, and I kind of put my arm around him because it's easier to kind of connect with his consciousness when there's some contact, especially when you're not completely familiar with someone yet. And we're still kind of new getting that whole relationship thing worked out. I concentrated on Kensington in Philadelphia, and then we appeared there. It's always a bit of a shock, and I could see the shock in him immediately because the aura of the place is just doom and gloom and suffering and wanting and addiction and pain that you kind of have to put up a screen to lessen the misery that is flowing through that place like some sort of invasive floodwater, just washing over the whole area. And if you're not prepared, it can basically kind of knock the wind out of you, as if somebody had punched you hard in the stomach in your physical body. So I helped him kind of get his equilibrium before we started working. And I told him that our job here was to see if we could assist some souls who have passed over in this area, and that we could get them out of this suffering purgatory that they're currently experiencing. They've passed, but because of their addiction, because of their suffering and their pain, they're just unable to go to the next level. Sometimes you can't even get their attention, but sometimes you can, and you try to work with them and help them to realize that they're keeping themselves in this horrible place of suffering, and to help them ask for assistance, to clear their minds, try to quiet all the hostility and addiction and fears, and just for a moment become clear and request aid so that they can then go to a place of healing rather than dwell in this hellish plane of suffering. So I was kind of briefing Peter on what we'd be doing. I told him I wanted him to watch while I worked with some people. And if he had any questions, of course, he could certainly ask me. So we walked for a bit, and I found there was this young woman. She looked like she was in her she looked like she was in her 40s, but I could read that she was a young woman, and she passed when she was in her early 20s. I could see a sore on her leg. She was wearing very short shorts and a very revealing type top with this awful sore on her leg. And she was just rocking back and forth in a ball on the ground. But I sensed that she wasn't completely out of it. I sensed that we might be able to reach her. So I was explaining to Peter what I was going to do to try to help this woman leave this lower astral hell. Peter then surprised me with this statement. He said, "Rick, she's a low woman. She's a woman of the streets. I can see that she sold her body for money to buy the poison that killed her." Well, this took me back for a moment. I mean, it's well known that it costs between $150 and a couple $100 at minimum to maintain a habit like she had on the streets. I've experienced this when I was working with others, so I know this information. And how else can a young woman earn that type of money on the streets of Philadelphia other than selling her body? But I was, of course, taken aback because of that sharp judgment coming from someone here who is my acolyte and who I have to train to become a guide. So I was shocked. And I looked at him and I said, "Does this mean that she has no soul?" That she has no eternal spark? He said, no, but I said, have you been appointed the judge over humanity? Will you be the one to decide who deserves help and who should be abandoned to their misery? He hung his head in silence. If he hadn't, I probably would have terminated our relationship right then and there. But I could see he was feeling shame. I said, Peter, there's a new plan now. I sense her name is Jessica, and she has lost her way. You're going to talk to her, and you're going to assist her in finding her way out of this place of agony. Or you can choose to find another teacher. The choice is yours. He stared at me for a moment, and he could tell I was not joking, that this was a deadly serious matter, and that he was being tested now, and that if he failed this test, he'd have to find another teacher somewhere else. At that, he collected himself, and then he sat down next to this poor young woman. He put his arm around her, and she recoiled a bit. But then she looked into his eyes, and she could tell that he did not mean her any harm. And he said, "What is your name, child?" And she told him, Jessica. And he said, "Jessica, what can I do to help you?" Now, at this, Jessica responded with some choice language, such as, "Get the F away from me, you," something about his mother, and some other string of obscenities. Now, I'm used to this type of thing. First of all, I was raised in the mid-20th to the early 21st century. So I'm quite used to young women speaking in this type of manner, unfortunately, because that's the world we live in. I wish I could say this was a rarity, but unfortunately, in this current world, this is the reality with which we are faced. But Peter was shocked. He was temporarily rendered without thought or speech. He was taken aback and deeply shocked. You have to remember that going back to his time period, let's say going back to the late 19th century, early 20th in Ireland, this is just not how you would typically hear Irish women in the villages and what have you speaking. But to his credit, he glanced at me and saw that nothing had changed and that I expected him to do what I asked him to do. So he recovered his composure, and once again, because she had knocked his arm away, he put his arm gently around her again. And he really sent her calming energies, which was the right thing to do, because we need to de-escalate at this point. We need her to feel comfortable, and we need her to feel not only not threatened, but also she doesn't need to be defensive. I saw her visibly calm with the energies that he was sending to her. And I kind of notched a nice little check mark for him there, because that's the type of situation you need to get a soul in before you can start working with them. And at first, he just continued sending that energy. And then she started to smile a little bit. And he said, "Do you want to stay in this place?" she looked at him, and at first she didn't know how to answer. And she said, I don't have anywhere else to go. I need what I need. And if I leave here, I won't be able to get what I need to survive. Keep in mind that to her mind, this trank drug was, it was like food, it was like water, it was everything to her. She was obviously suffering, but and the source of her suffering was this substance that she craved. So she was aware, even in her current state, that this poison was poison. And at the same time, she was afraid to leave because she feared that she'd be in worse pain if she did. So she was caught in this trap of her own making, that she knew she had to leave, but she was afraid to do so. I was wondering what Peter would do next, and he kind of impressed me with where he went next. He left that alone for a minute, because pressing someone who is caught in this addiction spell, by pressuring them, you can get them to shut down, and then you've lost for now, because once they shut down, you're done. So rather than press her, he asked her to tell him about her life. She hesitated at first, but then she kind of unburdened herself, and she said she had been raised in southern Philadelphia in a working class family. She had a mother and father, and to all outside sources, she seemed to have a perfect little middle class life. Unfortunately, and this was something that she admitted to only very hesitantly, and only after we gently assured her that she could tell us anything. And Peter was taking the lead here. I was just there, just smiling and sending some calm energy of my own. That's all I was doing, because this was Peter's job. And she admitted, as I said, very hesitantly, that her father had done things, horrible things to her, and that it had given her, well, she didn't express this, but I could see it in her mind. It had made her feel guilty, worthless, in pain. And because of those feelings of pain and inadequacy, she found herself getting high. It started with marijuana. She then experienced a broken arm, and she'd received opiates for that broken arm, opiates which she had become addicted to and had abused. But when the prescriptions had run out and the doctor wouldn't write them anymore, she found herself looking for drugs on the street. That had eventually led her to fentanyl and to trank. And it had also led her to the horrible life that she'd had to lead and what she'd had to do to support her addiction. She felt shame, once again, guilt and pain, and she had felt trapped. She had felt trapped for a long time and just didn't see any way out until she had passed. She had said that for a good period of time, she didn't even realize that she had passed over. But eventually, she had, I guess, met somebody, some fellow sufferer who had told her, and in not the most gentle way, but he had told her that they were dead and that they were in hell and that they were being punished for what they had done. So what Peter did at that point was just tell her that everything was forgiven and that she was loved, and that if she wished, she could leave this place of pain, of agony, of degradation, and go to a better place, a place of light, a place where she could receive the healing and the attention that she needed. And then he just sat there with her and let her think it over, until finally she looked around and said that, "I'm ready to go." With that, she disappeared. And I know that she went to a much better place, because there just aren't very many places on the astral plane that are worse than where she was dwelling in that lower astral pit of darkness that is the astral of Kensington area of Philadelphia. I gave a smile of approval to Peter because he'd proven himself. And I said, "Good job, Father Peter. I think we can continue to work with one another." With that, I dismissed him and I returned to my body because I could feel that I was being called back. We'd spent more time than I ordinarily would have spent in this type of rescue, but it was necessary, and Peter needed this experience. There's no other way around it. Well, if you found that experience of value, please hit the like button, share it with those of like minds. Subscribe if you haven't already. Please give me your questions and comments. How do you feel Peter did on this particular mission? And any other ideas you have, any other comments or experiences, anything at all, I'd be glad to read it, and I'm sure everyone else would too. This is Rick, and as always, I will see you on the astral plane.